I may or may not be the Rubber Von Ducker, and this is the second part, well, third part in my Blade Runner trilogy now, but the second part to my response to Doomcock, which features solely on the arguments for Deckard being a human. Now, first I have to examine the case given by Doomcock, and in that case, I'm actually going to start with his second theory rather than his first, because that's the easiest one to resolve, and that is...
Police force. What kind of replicant does that?
Any replicant that's programmed to do so. Every replicant, regardless whether they have memories or not, would need to be programmed for the task that they are created for, and presumably they can be programmed for any task. Boom, done. In under 13 seconds. I probably could have got it lower if I tried, but I'm not going to try. However, Doomcock does then go on for the best part of, I think, about 6 minutes, refuting this with his own fantasies of what they could do with rep. He does eventually point out this fact at almost at the very end of his section, but it takes a long time to get there. So I may have been a little bit unkind in the last video in saying that he doesn't address it, but he does generally just go off on a fantasy into what he wants to be the case. And to prove that, let's look at what he says next.
Don't be naive. Replicants could make wonderful deep cover agents, and in addition to kick murder squads on off-world colonies and pleasure units, couldn't some replicants be designed as deep undercover units created to pass, as humans, undetected? Presumably there are still political issues on Earth in 2019. Maybe rival countries, maybe rival corporations. There could be a huge market for replicant spies infiltrating foreign countries, corporations, private detective work. There are many reasons why the Tyrell Corporation might want to test deep cover replicants. If they were using Deckard and Rachel as experiments to see if replicants could be so perfect as to infiltrate human society without detection, they would want to step back and see how it all works out.
As ever, on the face of it, this seems a perfectly rational situation or suggestion. However, there is a couple of things wrong here. The first one I'd probably pick on is the use of replicants as spies. That is probably very, 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 very dangerous. Why? Well, one, it depends on whether replicant technology is limited to an individual country like the US, much similar to the nuclear weapon situation that we face ourselves in today. If you start using them as spies and one of them is discovered, there are a couple of different ways it could go. One, it leads to them basically having a replicant race and producing their own replicants to do the same thing, which I think is probably the unlikeliest scenario because a lot of these countries aren't going to have the resources to do so. The second, a more likely situation, is that you create paranoia in that country. Once you find one, and presumably they're going to be hard to detect as you've set them up as a major covert agent, presumably they are going to be hard to detect through any means. I mean, they're struggling now. If you are working on the basis they have memories as well, it's going to be almost impossible to tell them apart. That's going to create some serious paranoia. How much of the society has been infiltrated? How high up the command system does it go? And then it's relatively easy to say that at this point we should be declaring war on that country. Usually there'd be an argument about that. But if you're in a situation where there's extreme paranoia, your objection to going to war may well be seen as evidence you're a replicant. Any dissenting voices will be shot. The road to war seems certain. And what kind of war? Initially maybe it's ground-based war, but maybe eventually it becomes chemical or even nuclear war. That's a lot to risk on what? On creating some covert agent? And here's the thing, they don't even need to do it on Earth. After all, on Earth, replicants are banned. What you need to do is do it on an off-world colony. Take the situation we see in history here. They ban cloning, all the cloning companies and scientists go to a country where it's not illegal to clone. And the same is effectively true here. Yes, replicants are banned on Earth, but they aren't banned on the colonies. And given that the colonies are reliant on you for supply of replicants, then they are going to be more than willing to assist you in whatever experiment you want to do. So in realistic terms, the best place to do experimentation of different types of replicants is off-world, because you're free to experiment, you could technically, I'm sure the Tyrells could buy a planet and just do it there on their own planet. So there's no point to invest money into this process on Earth where there's risk, where you can just do it off-world. It makes no sense. It doesn't mean that the units can't exist. I don't understand why you'd make them on Earth, or even test them. Moving on.
If Deckard decided to up and quit his job at the police force, that wouldn't be a failure, nor would it be cause to decommission Deckard and eliminate him. Whatever Deckard did would be valuable data for the experiment.
Hang on a moment. Didn't you say...
Marks the moment when the human Gaff has expanded his definition of what it is to be human, or at least to be sentient and worthy of consideration. Respect. That's why Gaff lets Deckard and Rachel live.
But now you're saying it's money and fear of the corporation. It can't really be both. Moving on.
Terrell is a very wealthy man and would certainly have the juice to pull strings and place Deckard wherever he wanted, even inside the police department.
You stole that from RoboCop.
While most cops in the precinct wouldn't know about Deckard, certainly Bryant would need to know, and he probably brought Gaff in on the secret due to the emergency situation of escaped replicants on Earth.
Okay, let me stop you there a moment. Again, the Tyrell Corporation is going to spend a small fortune bribing people rather than just doing it off-world. No. If the Tyrell Corporation wants to have a market in the urban defense industry, or the police industry, then they'd be much better creating their model off-world, testing it fully, and then coming to the authorities and saying, hey, look, we've got these units that can do this. Wouldn't you like to buy them? Why don't you test them out on this colony? Couple of years. Oh, right, you like them. Oh, we'll sign a nice big fat contract. But you wouldn't just go, oh, let's experiment on Earth where it's illegal. Furthermore, I don't see why they would want to chase this kind of market. Tyrell industry is busy enough. It doesn't need to chase what would be a cheap market. And let's consider how cheap that market is. Everyone of any worth has left the planet. The only people who remain are the poor and those who are not medically fit to travel, like Sebastian. Which means low tax receipts for the government, so they're going to have very little spend, and probably most of it's going on social spending given the state of things. You're not going to be getting top dollar for your replicants there. Add to the fact that usually the political need for security in society is led by the middle class and the rich who have left. There's a question of whether there's even a political will in the people for it. But putting that aside, even if they were paying reasonable amounts, I still don't see they'll go for it. As I've mentioned in a previous video about my issues with Blade Runner 2049, at this point the Tyrell Corporation is effectively replacing 25% of the total replicant population every year. 4-year lifespan means that if you're a corporation, you need to replace a quarter of your replicants every year. Now, during the making of this, I've realised I've made a small mistake in that video, because I'm saying that the Tyrell Corporation would be quite happy staying as it is, replacing 25% of the replicants every year. And on the face of it, that sounds right, but when you stop to think about it, they wouldn't be happy about that. They would want to expand. They would want to increase the population. However, they are now limited by this issue of replacing a quarter of all replicants every year. Under these conditions, they have to keep expanding production to increase the total population of rep. For example, if 100% of production is used to resupply the 25% requirement, then if they add 50% capacity, first year they can sell all that as extra capacity, and the second and the third, the fourth year, that whole production has to now replace the ones from the first year. And so now you're no longer expanding, you're just replacing the same number over and over again. And this is the reason why Rachel exists. Rachel is an experiment to see if they can prolong the lifespan of a replicant. By that I mean are trying to keep them stable for longer. So if the Rachel experiment is successful, they could be looking at an 8-year lifespan. Don't forget, the lifespan is only decided by the fact that they are putting it in themselves. They can create replicants that live forever. We know this. So the only thing that's stopping them from having longer lifespans is the fact that they tend to be defective after 4 years. And it should be immediately obvious how much of a benefit that will be to the Tyrell Corporation. That said, they don't want to get rid of the lifespan. They just want to extend it so that they can extend the population and maintain it at a more profitable rate. But what this does mean is that replicants are in limited supply, so they're going to be more expensive, so you're going to have to pay top dollar to get any extra capacity. This is evidenced as well by the fact that you've got people still trying to recruit on Earth to go off-world. Why would you do that if you've got plenty of capacity? You'd only do that if you're desperate for staff. And it's even more desperate when you consider, as I've said previously, these are the dregs of what was on Earth. These are the people who are not first choice, not second choice, they're last choice. And they're still trying to recruit because they need the manpower. And they're probably more expensive than replicants, because if you're making a replicant, you'd make the metabolism efficient, meaning minimum amount of input of food or whatever, maximum energy output. Is going to be massively different to a human being. They could probably survive on next to nothing. And that's before you even take labour laws into account. So supplying them to the police, it just doesn't seem to be a major requirement for the Tyrell Corporation. Add to that the fact that, as Deckard says in that briefing, that it was unusual for replicants to come to Earth. It's not a common event, so our government's really going to want to spend that much money on buying something that they don't generally need? Have a Blade Runner unit sitting around for 4 years and, oh dear, now it's out of date, now we need a new Blade Runner, and we haven't had a Blade Runner incident. It's been 20 years, we've gone through 5 Blade Runners that are replicants, but we've had no incidents. Nah, governments aren't going to sign that off. Now at this point I'm going to skip ahead a bit. If you want to see what's said, go and see Doomcock'S video, it is worth watching.
Notice how Bryant looks so uneasily at Deckard when he says over time they might start developing their own emotional responses.
Actually, that's a point where he tells him about the 4-year lifespan, which is just after the scene you've mentioned, but it is a different cut.
Look at his expression in this scene. Sure, he could be uneasy about the replicants being on Earth.
Or he could be uneasy because he knows Deckard can count, and therefore has worked out there's a missing replicant. But more realistically, he's feeling uneasy because he's building up to ask Deckard to go and put the machine on the Nexus 6 over at the Tyrell Corporation. And he knows he's going to turn around and say, what if a machine doesn't work? And I know that because the expression that he gives Deckard after he says that, and the total absence of any answer, is pretty much what I've seen from most of management whenever I've brought up the fact that what they're asking us to do is illegal. They're not going to say it is, they're not going to say it isn't. But you're still expected to do it for some reason. Now this does continue for a bit with Doomcock, but only to say more of the same effectively, that bribe all the police and they'll be happy to have more replicants roaming around, which I doubt is the case. So let's look at the next argument, which was the original argument in this section that Doomcock tries to debunk.
One of the arguments is the notion that replicants have special abilities depending on their models. Roy Batty, Pris, Zora, Leon, each of them was created for a particular purpose with enhanced abilities. Deckard, to all appearances, has no such abilities, the argument goes, and since all replicants are specialized, Deckard can't be a replicant. To which I reply, hogwash. Rachel is a replicant, and Rachel doesn't have any special abilities.
You mean apart from looking like a stone-cold fox? Now, I've got to say I've never heard this kind of a theory put forward, or at least I think it might be a scrambled version of a similar theory. Where to start? I guess with the idea that each replicant is created for an individual purpose. That is just not the case. They're mass-produced. Once again, the evidence for that is in the briefing that Deckard gets. And on the screen, we see all 4 of the replicants he's to hunt, and their breakdowns. And here they are. As you can see, you've got 2 primary requirements, which are physical and mental. Physical for all 4, as you can see, is A, so I'm getting the distinct feeling that all Nexus models are A on physical, so they have the same physical abilities and characteristics, whether that's putting your hand in boiling water or freezing ice or any of those kind of things we see from the replicants. As I've said, I'd expect the metabolism to be same in all of them, the most efficient possible. After all, these are more human than human, and as you're selling them as labour, you want them to be the most efficient, especially if they've only got a 4-year life cycle. You don't want them to break down, you don't want them to be out of service. Now, the second characteristic is mental, and as you can see, it goes from A to C. A for Roy, all the way down to C for Leon, with the 2 ladies both being B. So we can see that there is a kind of grade A to C at least of these models, so they very much are manufactured en masse. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be specialised, because if you look at Zora's file, we can see that she has had special training. It says retrained in political assassination, so you can program these. You don't need them to be specialised, you just need them to fit certain criteria on physical ability and mental ability. There's nothing specifically unique to them. Furthermore, I suspect if you actually go to a colony and look out at the sea of faces you might see, you'll find a lot of them are identical. Now, this also would apply to Rachel, and that might explain something. And here we have a photo at the moment that Rachel shoots Leon. Look at this shot. It's a headshot. Perfect shooting. And we know she's a replicant, and that's probably why she can do it. The other argument is maybe she's got Tyrell's niece's memories of going to gun training or something along those lines. But it's a good shot. I mean, she's shooting past Deckard, but she can do it because she has the best reflexes, the best hand-to-eye coordination that Tyrell could make. And that comes to the argument that I do know. See, the argument I remember is not that Deckard hasn't got special abilities. It's much worse than that. Deckard is incompetent, is incapable. And the best way I can show that is through the comparison with Rachel. Rachel basically pulls out or picks up a gun and shoots it and hits first time with a headshot. Now let's compare how well Deckard does with Zora. First shot, miss. Second shot, miss. Then Zora goes through a glass window, causing more damage to herself than Deckard has at this point. Third shot, hit, but not killing hit. Finally, fourth shot, hit and kill. And again, Rachel, one shot to the head, done. She's pinpointed a kill shot, whereas Deckard just seems to be firing randomly, although he is aiming. The same is true of Pris, which takes 2 or 3 shots depending on which version you're watching, and this doesn't even take into account the number of times that the replicants have got the drop on him. His reactions are clearly not up to the Nexus 6. And in the final battle with Roy, Deckard has his shooting hand crushed, so he can't shoot with it, and when he attempts to shoot with his other hand is off because he's not ambidextrous, which you would think replicants would be ambidextrous, because there's no point building in that defect. What's more, you could question whether Deckard is bad even for a Blade Runner. The fact that he quit may indicate that he realised that. Or it could be for the second theory that you haven't mentioned, and that is that Deckard shows a lot of emotional response. Of all the emotions that Bryant referenced in the briefing, I'm going to focus on just one: fear. It's the emotion he displays most often. And to start with, I'd highlight an instant where there was no fear, which seems a bit strange considering what I've just said, but you'll see later on that that will come into play. And that's a scene where Gaff is picking him up at the beginning at the noodle stand, and they're effectively approach him from behind. He acts all casual as if he doesn't know what's going on. He's totally fine. The first time in the movie that we do see him show some fear, though, is when he's in the lift going to his apartment and Rachel is hiding in the corner, and he suddenly realises and pulls his gun. Obviously looks shocked at that point. Then they get out the lift and he's trying to move away from her, fumbling with his door pass, which falls on the floor and that she picks up and is hesitant to take from her. He is in fear of this replicant that may have gone rogue already, that may be there to kill him. Then there's the point where Gaff approaches him from behind whilst he's buying the alcohol I mentioned in the previous video. Gaff taps him on the shoulder and he immediately whirls round and grabs the cane. Deckard's breathing goes shallow, so he's actually drawing quite a lot of breath to the point where you can tell, obviously showing he's had a reaction. Again, it's a fear reaction. Shortly after this, he runs into Leon, and again we see fear on his face, multiple times. And the final one I will raise, because there are plenty more, is at the very end, when he returns to the apartment and goes to see if Rachel is alive. There is fear of loss, which technically I suppose you could say is love, but there is fear of loss. He's actually, before he finds out she's alive, you can see it's etched onto his face. And if you don't accept my word, then how about Leon? Leon himself asks Deckard, it's painful to live in fear, isn't it? A question of confirmation. Leon knows this, and he's trying to get Deckard to admit it too. Then almost at the end of a movie where Deckard is hanging over the side of a building, Roy says to him, it's quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave. Mirroring Leon's question, but with the acknowledgement that Deckard is just as much a slave to the situation as he is. Now I come to a personal observation. Some of you may have noticed I referred to Deckard as both Decker and Deckard throughout all the videos. And that is on purpose, because we have Gaff at the very beginning of the movie referring to Deckard as Decker, and it is in a derogatory way. So again, we've got a taunting of Deckard, which again, why would you do that if you know it's a robot? But there's also seems to be a similar situation with the noodle seller, in the fact that they are not willing to speak English to him, and yet he clearly can, because he translates for Deckard later. So there is another kind of snub in the face to Deckard, suggesting that he has no worth in society at all, outside of being a Blade Runner, and with a Blade Runner effectively being a bounty hunter and not really a cop. I guess that's how society will see him, whether he's retired or not. If you doubt that he's not a full police officer, I draw your attention to the fact that when they search the hotel, he has to take Gaff with him. They actually meet up, go into the hotel, because Gaff's got to be there. An official police officer has got to be there. Blade Runners aren't real police officers. They're kind of shunned by everyone because they are killers. Their job is to kill. Now, much like Doomcock'S suggestion that by Deckard being a replicant it sells a message of the movie, the same is true if Deckard is human, only it's a very different message. And the message there is more the redemption of a replicant, because Roy saves Deckard from dying, and you could argue it's because, like I've just said, he recognises that he's just as much slave to the system as he is. If Deckard is a replicant, then he's just saving one of his own kind. But if Deckard is human, he's saving one of his enemies, one of his masters. And that implies a greater sanctity of life, that even my enemy is worth saving, which seems more poignant in the modern day. Now, I'm sure this isn't an exhaustive list of theories as to why Deckard might be human. I haven't googled it. This is purely off the top of my head from memory when I last discussed it, which was probably back before the director's cut. Now, are these arguments conclusive? Should you run away and say, Rubber Van Ducker's solved it? No, because there is a counter-argument to these arguments, and that is that Deckard could still be a replicant, he just might not be a Nexus 6. He might be a really early version. There was a period when replicants weren't banned on Earth. It was only after an incident off-world that they were banned on Earth. There was no need for a 4-year lifespan. They could live forever, and that would explain why he's malfunctioning. He's got old and beaten from so many jobs that he's not in a fit state to do the job. Maybe that's really why he retired, even if he is a replicant. And if he is 10, 15, 20 years old, that's more than enough time to start building up emotional responses. Could be a Nexus 1. Now, at this point, some of you are probably saying, what the duck, Rubber Ducker? Where do you stand on this? Whilst others who have noticed that my opening has changed to something very specific will know where I'm going with this. You see, the quote I've been using is from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and the reason I've been using it is whilst I was editing the first part of this two-parter, I got hit on the head by my Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy box set, the BBC version. And it was then when I realised what my position was. And it is, I demand rigidly defined areas of doubt and uncertainty. That's right, I've muddied the waters completely to ensure this question isn't answered. And I've got two reasons for doing it. The first, again coming from Hitchhikers, what is the point of trying to be a YouTuber or a bit shooter, arguing whether Deckard is a human or a replicant, if Doomcock only goes and gives you his serial number in the morning? One would think an overlord like Doomcock would see the wisdom of what the second greatest computer in the universe said.
Everyone's going to have his own theory, and who better to capitalize on that media market than you yourselves? So long as you can keep violently disagreeing with each other and slagging each other off in the popular press, and so long as you have clever agents, you can keep yourselves on the gravy train for life.
The second reason is a lot less selfish, but is based on a question I was asked recently, which is why do we need fiction? And I've thought about that quite a bit, and it very much depends on how old you are. If you're like me, nearer to retirement than birth, it has little value. But for someone nearer to birth than retirement, then it has a lot of value. We're still learning in that stage. And fiction, be it in books, be it in film, offers you the chance to have a different perspective. Once you get older, you've read a lot of books, there are only so many perspectives, you're limited to find anything new. And maybe that's why the question was asked. And in Blade Runner, we have a rarity. Something, despite all the trials and tribulations on set and the many different variants that have come out, still leaves us in a position to question and theorise about many aspects of it. Teaches us to question the very reality of the film itself and to allow young minds to grow. Obviously, it's not just this film, there are others, and equally in other art forms. The Mona Lisa. That's not the greatest painting ever painted, or at least it's hard to argue it, considering it was sat in a cellar for a couple of hundred years. But what it is something itself quite unique. The real interest in the Mona Lisa isn't how well it's painted, well, it is to an aspect, but it's the smile. What is she smiling about? What kind of smile is it? It's all down to interpretation. Imagine what would happen if we made a time machine tomorrow, went back in time and asked the model, what were you smiling about? And her answer is, well, it was because Leonardo da Vinci cracked the most evil fart ever. And just like that, the Mona Lisa is back in that cellar. By definitively defining Deckard as either replicant or human, all we do is put the film in the cellar. And given the state of Hollywood writing, I would not expect a replacement to come anytime soon. In my youth, I'd have probably said, yeah, we can afford to lose it. But now, with the quality of writing we're seeing, we can't afford to lose something like this, because what will the kids of tomorrow have to dissect? Nothing. Now, for those who made it this far, there is one last thing I can do to muddy the waters completely, and that is to bring up in full the fact that when Deckard has a briefing, he's told that 6 replicants leave the colony. One of them is allegedly fried at Tyrell's on an electrical fence. There were 3 men, 3 women, 4 that Deckard hunts down, so that means there's 1 left. Now, we don't know the sex of that replicant. Could have been male, could have been female. Depends on which one got fried. But if it's male, then that could well be Deckard. Deckard could be the missing replicant. However, as Ridley Scott, as Doomcock has told us repeatedly, insists they are replicants, and he's had the chance to create his definitive cut, we can only assume that that wasn't intended, as Ridley Scott changed the briefing back to what it was in the original work cut, which shows you that they filmed both, and so Deckard can't be the missing replicant, because now 2 get fried on the fence rather than 1. But it does beg the question, if that was not the original intent of a theatrical release, why didn't they use a cut where 2 people get fried on the fence? We'll never know, and I'm happy about that. I've been the Rubber Von Ducker. Be seeing you.